Hi, my name is Eric Kimberling. Thanks for watching our video today. I'm the CEO and founder of Third Stage Consulting, which is an independent digital transformation consulting firm. And I'm here with Marcus Harris. Marcus, thanks for joining us again today.
Yeah, absolutely, Eric. Thank you for the invitation.
Sure. So Marcus, today we're going to talk about how to negotiate contracts with your SAP S/4HANA system integrator, which is an area you and I are both big fans of and have a lot of opinions on. So that's what we wanted to start with here today. But before we do that, tell us a little bit about yourself and some of the work you do with your clients.
Right. Well, my name is Marcus Harris. I am a partner at the law firm of Taft, Stettinius, and Hollister. It's a larger law firm. I work out of the Chicago office. I practice software and intellectual property law. My practice really encompasses primarily drafting and negotiating a wide variety of technology agreements, with the sweet spot being in these types of contracts that we're talking about today, the software licensing agreements and the software implementation contracts. Prior to entering private practice, I worked in the legal departments of SAP and Infor as well.
So you've gotten to see the whole negotiation process from both sides of the table, it sounds like.
Yeah, and I think that's really one of the kind of the value adds that I offer and that my firm offers. It's really deep industry expertise. So, when we're talking about these contracts, it's really not just from a customer's perspective. It's really kind of getting down to brass tacks and having an understanding of what's reasonable for both sides. I've got a pretty good understanding of what SAP is going to agree to, what they're not going to agree to, and what is reasonable and what you should really end up with as far as a contract at the end of the day.
Sure. Yeah. So if I'm a client and I've decided that I'm going to go down the path of S/4HANA, I'm going to start this big transformation that's going to take however many years. I may be leaning towards a certain system integrator, whether it's Deloitte, Accenture, Capgemini, whoever it might be. What are the things that I should be aware of when I'm negotiating a contract with them? What are some of the biggest pitfalls or things or best practices you've seen when negotiating with a big system integrator?
Right. Well, I think fundamentally, you've got to understand as a customer or someone that's going to be implementing software that if your implementation is going to fail, it's most likely not going to fail because of the technology. Point of fact, SAP works. It's worked in hundreds of thousands of implementations across the world. That's not to say that there won't be, certain issues with the particular functionality that you're licensing. It could be new, it could be untested. There could have been some, misrepresentations or overeager salespeople that promised you or overpromised you essentially. So, that's a little bit of a separate issue than this. But I think, the technology generally works. Implementations don't usually fail because of a technology issue. They fail because of people issues. And I think when you're negotiating these contracts, what you really want to keep in mind is drafting and negotiating agreements that are going to manage that implementation process, throughout the life cycle of the implementation project, certainly. And depending on the kind of integrator that you have engaged and the kinds of services they're going to be providing, it could very well be a contract that manages your relationship with that vendor much longer than the go live and the conclusion of that implementation project. So that's the first thing I think that's super important.
Right. Now, what about, you and I have done some expert witness cases together, or I've supported you as an expert witness on some of the lawsuits that you've been involved with. What are some of the things that you've seen that the end client has gotten in trouble with in some of these SAP contracts? Things that maybe they didn't have buttoned up, or things that exposed them to additional liability that they might have been able to avoid if they had thought about it earlier on?
Yeah, that's a good question. And one of the things that I will typically see over and over again in these implementation disputes, especially when they get to litigation, they're all different in certain ways, but they're also all kind of similar in certain ways. And the one of the common threads running through many of them is that I think clients sometimes have unreasonable expectations. So what I mean by that is, they've got unreasonable expectations with respect to what that technology is going to do for them. And they may also have unreasonable expectations about how simple that implementation project is going to be. So, for example, they don't necessarily want to be hands-on. They don't feel the need to have their own project management team. They don't have the need or feel the need to have, a steering committee, executive sponsors, typical kind of best practices type things that you see in most projects. That's a common thread that we see, is just not having reasonable expectations as to how difficult the implementation is going to be. And then what that results on the back end is contracts that were not drafted appropriately to account for many of the things that need to be addressed during the implementation project. Does that sound familiar to you in the implementations that you've dealt with?
Yeah. The roles and responsibilities aren't clearly defined, or the thing I always, I don't love it, but you find it interesting to see is when you have those little bullet, the one little bullet behind an assumption, something like, client shall be responsible for all data conversion. It's just one little bullet in the contract, but that's a huge bullet. I mean, that's a lot of cost and risk that you're taking on, which is okay as long as you understand what that means and you understand that the system integrator in that case is not going to be doing that for you.
Right. I mean, I think these little things that might seem simple and might encompass a bullet point in a contract, if they're not properly unpacked or vetted, they're going to have huge consequences. I mean, at Stratosphere last year, one of our speakers was essentially a data expert and with a lot of experience in data conversion and the like. And one of the things that she said during the conference really kind of has stuck with me, and that is that data is like the water, and all of the technology and the work that you're doing. It's like the plumbing, and if you've got like the best plumbing, but you don't have any water, or your water is corrupted, so to speak, you're going to have a problem. So it really is the devil in the details. And I think what you've got to do from a contractual standpoint, from a negotiation standpoint, is really use that process to really, like I said, unpack all these things. And you've got to engage people that have the experience level to be able to tell you, this bullet point is huge and it encompasses maybe 15 to 20 steps, and all of those steps need to be enumerated in the contract, and the roles and responsibilities need to be very well understood. So that's a key issue with these types of agreements, and I agree with you. What else do you see beyond just roles and responsibilities not being defined properly?
Well, a lot of it is just not understanding what's required of you, the implementing organization. For example, when a system integrator says they're going to deliver the technical testing, and they're going to facilitate user acceptance testing, for example, there's a whole host of stuff that needs to happen by you, the implementing company, to support that and to validate the user acceptance testing. So a lot of companies kind of have somewhat of a hands-off outsourced approach to these implementations, thinking, well, the big system integrator, they're the experts, just let's let them take care of it. But there's a lot of things that in some ways you have to do, and you want to make sure that it's not only reflected in your contract as a system integrator, but in your project plan and your budgeting and just understanding what your resource needs are. And I think that disconnect between what's in the contract or what isn't in the contract and what reality needs to be, sometimes it seems like there's a gap there.
Yeah, I agree. There's a huge gap there many times, and one of the projects that we actually worked on together, and I won't, for confidentiality reasons, I'm not going to disclose the name or the vendor or the customer, but that was an interesting scenario, and I'm sure once I start talking, you'll remember which one I'm referring to. This customer essentially wanted the vendor to come in, and they washed their hands. The customer wanted to wash their hands of any responsibility associated with the project. I remember one particular aspect about that was that when the vendor came in to do business process analysis, flow charting and the like, this client threw their hands up and said, "We've already done that. We know how we do all of these things. We're engaging you to, implement the best practices that you do for other companies in our industry." And to me, that's just a shocker. I mean, first, that particular integrator doesn't know what your particular processes are, and it needs to have some understanding of what you do so it can understand how to implement the software. And if you're relying on a system integrator to tell you what the best practices are in your industry, I think you're already well down the road to a failure. So, that really is problematic. And I think the way that you've got to get out of that hole is to really have, a well thought out contract with hopefully, not necessarily some substantive negotiation, but you've got to, that's a process in and of itself that you've got to take seriously. It's not a 2-day process. It can sometimes take months to negotiate a contract that really addresses all of these issues. And they've all got to be spelled out, because at the end of the day, once you have that contract, and I've said this before in some of these other videos, the goal is to have a contract that functions as a tool to manage that relationship, so that there are no hidden expectations. Everybody knows what's going to happen. And if you do that, then I think you've got a long way to a successful contract negotiation, and what's more, having a successful implementation.
Yeah, I totally agree. And a couple of weeks ago, one of our team members, and I know you read this blog, but one of our team members wrote an article about getting Accentured, which was kind of a verb that was used to describe basically when a big system integrator comes in and just kind of takes over the project, and you lose control essentially of the project. And it was interesting because I shared that article on social media, and I got a ton of responses back from people that thought I wrote it, which I didn't, but people thought I wrote it, and they were sending me comments, and a lot of them were from consultants at these big system integrators that were agreeing with me. And it was really surprising, because I thought I was going to have this backlash from just sharing the article, from people saying, hey, you don't know what you're talking about, or that's not how it is, or at least countering me or arguing with me or whatever. And so it was just interesting to hear that dynamic. But the reason I bring this up is a lot of times companies don't know how to preserve, or they don't recognize the need to keep control of their system integrator. So if I'm negotiating a contract with one of these big system integrators, how do I keep control? What are some of the mechanisms that I can include in my contract to ensure that I'm in charge? I'm not totally just giving this up to give free reign to the system integrator.
Right. That is a nightmare scenario. And there's nothing, that some of these large system integrators love more. I mean, I don't want to bash on them necessarily, because I've dealt with many of them, and they're filled with integrity. But there's sometimes the business pressure gets to you, and you're involved in a long implementation when maybe it doesn't need to be as long or complicated. The way that you maintain control is to have the systems in place in your implementation contract and in your statement of work that really serve to wrestle the control away from that integrator, so that they've got to account to you. And what I mean by that specifically is you really have to detail the stages of the implementation. You've got to think this stuff through. You want to have different stages, different milestones, penalties for when those milestones are not met. They don't have to be monetary penalties necessarily, but something needs to happen that's going to allow you to maintain the control that's necessary, and that there's some action that happens when the integrator doesn't meet the deadline. You've got to have some methodology in the contract for accepting and rejecting deliverables that they provide to you, so that you've got the specifications are mutually agreed upon in writing. That when they're delivered, they've got to meet those specifications, and when they don't, certain things are going to happen. So, for example, you've got 2 weeks to review and reject, and if you reject it, they've got a certain period of time to reperform those services and redeliver the deliverable for another acceptance period. And then you figure out, well, how many bites of the apple are they going to get for that deliverable, and if it doesn't ultimately work, what's going to happen? And all of that can be spelled out with specificity in the contract. That, for me, is one of the key ways from a legal perspective and from a contractual perspective to really maintain control, wrestle control away from those system integrators, so that this implementation is being done on your timeline and at your direction. What are the ways that you see people can do that? Customers can wrestle control away from an integrator on the business side, Eric?
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that can be done from I'll call it a project governance perspective, that are not only things that you would want to implement in the way you run the project, but it's also stuff that I would suspect someone like you could help bake into a system integrator contract up front. But some of the things we look for is, first of all, the PMO. So how are we going to manage this project? It may not be that the system integrator is the overall program manager. A lot of our more successful clients have had a internal program manager, or in some cases they will hire someone like us to be that program manager to manage not just the system integrator, but all the other moving parts in a complex S/4HANA transformation. So having that spelled out early on in your governance is really important. Another one is the resourcing and the ability for you to control the resourcing of the system integrator. And what I mean by that is a lot of times the system integrator will come forth and say, look, we're the experts in S/4HANA. We know what this is going to take. It's going to take 100, 200 people full time for the next 3 years or whatever it is to do this implementation. And that's going to be millions of dollars. And a lot of times companies feel like they have to take that at face value because you don't know any better. So, and you may not know any better. You may not know enough up front whether that's a good or bad number, but as long as you have something along the way that gives you control over who and how many and how people get staffed on the project, so you have some kind of ownership of that, that's another one that from a project governance perspective, as well as from a contractual perspective up front, can be very helpful. And then another one that I think I've actually learned from you or seen you deal with is the cancellation clauses. Things aren't working out, or whether it's one particular resource or the entire team or whatever, how do I get out of this contract, basically? So those are a few things that come to mind.
Yeah, no, those are some good points. And I think on the contractual side, those are things that we can address. I've seen, consulting agreements, services agreements that actually go through the process of assigning consultants to a particular project. Customers want to see resumes. They want to make sure they've got a certain amount of experience, and they want to have a process for rejecting or getting rid of particular consultants when they don't believe things are working out. So that's something that certainly will wrestle control away from an integrator, and something that I highly recommend most customers put in their contracts to the extent they can. I mean, that creates substantive issues for most system integrators. They're not going to want to give up that level of control because they're going to want to maintain some flexibility as to who can be assigned and who can't. And but what you want to avoid, and I see this all the time, is a situation where you thought you were getting the A team and you end up getting not even the C team, maybe the D team, because there's an influx of other projects that have a higher dollar amount associated with them. The integrator is devoting resources to those other projects, and you've got these junior consultants on your project whereby the system integrator is essentially using your project as a training ground for inexperienced and unqualified consultants. So those are the kinds of things that you've got to be ready for and anticipate, and have a plan for dealing with before they actually happen.
Yeah. An example of where I at one point was part of the machine, if you will, or I was on the other side with system integrators before I started Third Stage. I worked for one of the big system integrators early in my career, straight out of graduate school. And the first project I was put on, I was in charge of a certain business process work stream. So my responsibility was to re-engineer the process. And it was a pretty, it was my first project, so it was pretty narrow scope of what I had. But I remember it was probably a solid 5 to 10 hours a week of effort that it was requiring for me. And I had all this bandwidth but I was at the client 50 hours a week, billing 50 hours a week. And I was kind of looking for stuff to do and trying to get involved in other stuff. And, we had this huge team there. I think it was like 60 or 80 people on this project. And they're just, everyone had their little silos or whatever they were working in. And the reason I bring it up is because that, I think back even then it didn't feel right. And it was like, someone should be rationalizing this cost that I'm incurring for what actually needs to be done. And, you think back to it now in hindsight, and that should have been the client ultimately. I mean, the implementing company owns that, and you can say shame on the system integrator for not being efficient or whatever, but really it's on you because you're the one, bringing that vendor to the table. So I'm not saying, just like you, I'm not saying all system integrators are bad or this happens all the time, but it's more common than it should be, and something that, buyers should be aware of and just be ready to plan for and build into their contracts and everything.
Yeah, I agree with you. Definitely.
So what are your thoughts then? We get this question a lot. I know you have to deal with this quite a bit too. A lot of our clients will say, well, I know what we're going to do. We're going to do a fixed bid contract, or we're going to do a not to exceed. And that'll really hold their feet to the fire. That'll make sure that, there's no way we could go over budget, and we'll finish this on time. There'll be penalties or whatever if it takes longer. What are your thoughts on the whole fixed bid, not to exceed concept with contracts?
I'm generally not a fan of them, and it doesn't matter which side I'm on. If I'm representing a system integrator or I'm representing a customer, I typically just don't like them. I think the incentives are just not there necessarily. And what I mean by that is, I think if you've got a project that is, maybe going off the rails a little bit, it looks like there might be a risk that it's going to take longer. The deadlines are not going to be met. It's going to cost more than is budgeted. I think the incentive in that scenario for an integrator that is in a fixed bid project or a not to exceed project or a risk reward project, which is something I see sometimes as well, is to cut corners, is to, they want to come in at what they said they were going to come in at or below it. And I think, like I said, the incentive to cut corners, to not do the adequate testing, to not assign people at the right level, or to just devote enough resources from a consultant perspective to get this thing on the right track, it may not really be there to some extent. I mean, I think, what are your thoughts? Do you see that? I mean, there's time and material certainly in fixed bid, but what do you see as the risks associated with a fixed bid project?
I totally agree with you. I don't think either side at the end of the day really benefits. I think it harms both parties more than it probably helps. And the reason for that isn't because fixed bid contracts are inherently bad necessarily. It's just that you don't know enough at that contract stage of the project to know exactly how long this is all going to take. I mean, we're not talking about, if we were just talking about configuring and deploying an S4 HANA solution that worked from a technical perspective, yeah, we could probably fix bid that and everyone's going to be pretty happy with that. But the problem is it's all the wild cards that you can't account for. The company's culture that's implementing, their ability to, adjust quickly to the changes or not, other resource commitments that they have on the project or not. All that stuff factors in, and so you don't really know. And so to your point, you end up cutting corners when you realize, oops, we underestimated. Now, in order to get this done, we're going to have to cut corners. And even if it was a reasonable bid to begin with, if you think about it, to your point about the incentives being misaligned, you're still incentivized to maximize profit by doing it for as little effort as possible because you're going to make more money. So you don't want to create that economic incentive and assume that people's, character or integrity is going to somehow override their economic incentive because, on a big scale like that, it's not always reasonable.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And then, from a failure perspective and certainly from a litigation perspective, I'll be honest, I don't see those types of projects aren't the ones that I see most often in litigation. It's pretty even. I mean, I think, it skews towards disputes being associated with just time and materials because I think there's just way more time and material projects out there. But certainly we do see a reasonable number of project failures that are, fixed bid or these kind of alternative scenarios to a time and materials. And I think to me that suggests that maybe, there might be a problem with them potentially. I mean, I think, if you've got a good integrator that's able to estimate appropriately and accurately, that's one thing. But I don't know how they do that for some of the reasons that you said, because I think there's just so many unknowns that you're walking right into. And it creates risk and misaligned incentives.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, this is a great conversation, Marcus. I think there's we could spend hours talking about all the nuances of these contracts with system integrators, but I think for a primer or a starting point, I think this is a good overview. If people want to learn more about you, how would they get a hold of you or read some of your stuff, contact you, all that good stuff?
Yeah, we've got a pretty extensive blog at softwarenegotiation.com. There's a resource center with videos and downloadable material that people that are going to be implementing software can look at and kind of get an idea of what's in front of them, what the lay of the land is going to look like. We've got documents that talk about the anatomy of an ERP dispute, so you can hopefully try to avoid that. We've got checklists for contract negotiation and those types of things, and that's at softwarenegotiation.com. It's it's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. My law firm's website is taftlaw.com, and all of my contact information in my bio is on there as well. What about you, Eric? What's the best way to get a hold of you?
So our website is thirdstage-consulting.com. And I'm also pretty active on LinkedIn and Twitter, which I know you are too. So if you search up Eric Kimberling, all one word, on either LinkedIn or Twitter or YouTube, on the YouTube channel, you can find me that way. So
Great.
Yeah, thanks very much for your time today, Marcus. So appreciate the discussion, and I appreciate the conversation. This was good.
Yeah, as always, I appreciate the invitation to talk. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Marcus. Have a good one.